After 3 years apart, a German shepherd saw a familiar face in a crowd and instantly began to cry. What happened in the next few seconds was so powerful it left everyone watching speechless and proved that true loyalty never fades with time. Point 3. Years earlier, Max had been more than a dog. He was David's shadow, his confidant, the steady heartbeat that made an empty house feel like a home. Every evening, Max waited by the door, tail thumping against the wall the moment David's truck pulled into the drive. Then came that camping trip, a weekend in the mountains to clear their heads after a hard winter. David still replayed the moment over and over. Max chasing a rabbit into the trees, the leash slipping from David's fingers. One minute, he was there. The next, the forest swallowed him whole. David searched for days, calling until his voice turned raw. Flyers fluttered from trailheads and telephone poles. He left out food and blankets, returned every weekend to hike the same paths, hoping he'd hear that familiar bark. But after weeks turned into months with no sign of Max, hope began to fade into a hollow ache he carried everywhere. Friends told him he'd done all he could, that it was time to move on. David nodded, but he never stopped looking. Even as the seasons changed and snow erased old tracks, he scanned every roadside and shelter listing, wishing for a miracle. Somehow, against all odds, Max survived. He learned to slip through alleys and backyards, to beg just enough to stay alive, but never long enough to be caught. For 3 years, he became a ghost dog, always searching for something no one else could see. It was a gray afternoon when everything changed. The sky hung low and heavy with the threat of rain. David was driving through a neighborhood he hadn't seen in years, on his way to visit an old friend who'd recently moved back to town. At the intersection, the light turned red, and David eased his truck to a stop. He drummed his fingers absently on the steering wheel, mind drifting to the errands he needed to run. That was when a blur of movement caught his eye. A German shepherd was weaving through stopped cars, long legs splashed with mud, ribs showing under a weathered coat. Drivers honked as the dog darted in front of them, but he didn't flinch. His gaze swept over each windshield, searching, until it landed on David's. Their eyes locked, and the world seemed to tilt. For an instant, David forgot how to breathe. The dog froze in the middle of the lane, ears pricking forward, mouth falling open in a silent gasp of recognition. David's heart pounded so hard it hurt. "Max," he whispered, his voice breaking. He fumbled for the handle and shoved the door open just as the light turned green. Horns blared, tires squealed, but the dog didn't move away. Instead, he took one cautious step toward the truck, his head tilting as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. A woman on the sidewalk clapped a hand over her mouth, watching wide-eyed. David stood beside his truck, hands shaking. "Buddy, it's me," he called, louder this time. And then, as if the last 3 years had been nothing but a bad dream, the German shepherd let out a single, high-pitched whine and began to run straight for him. Max bounded across the last stretch of pavement as if nothing else existed in the world. His paws slapped against the asphalt, his nails clicking in a frantic rhythm. Cars braked around them, drivers leaning out their windows to stare, but David barely noticed. The moment Max reached him, all the dog's careful, feral wariness vanished. He reared up, placing his front paws on David's chest, and let out a string of desperate, broken cries, like all the longing and loneliness he'd carried for years were pouring out at once. David fell to his knees on the wet concrete, his arms locked around Max's neck, pulling him close. The dog smelled of rain and old leaves and something David couldn't name: survival. "I thought I lost you," he choked out, burying his face in Max's fur. Tears blurred everything, but he didn't care. He felt Max's ribs heaving with each breath, felt the quivering muscles under his hands. Max licked David's cheek over and over, whining so loudly people across the intersection turned to look. A teenage girl on a bicycle stopped, tears welling in her eyes as she watched the reunion. For a moment, there was no traffic, no years between them, just the man and the dog who had always been each other's family. David pulled back enough to see Max's eyes, searching for doubt or fear. But there was none, only recognition, pure and fierce. "You came back," David whispered, voice raw. Max rested his forehead against David's, and in that quiet touch, every mile, and every lost day vanished. They were together again, and neither of them would ever let go. David knew he couldn't just scoop Max into the truck and drive away, no matter how much he wanted to. Animal control had already been called. He could hear the siren wailing somewhere in the distance. He tightened his arms around Max and whispered, "It's okay, buddy. We'll figure this out." Minutes later, a white van pulled up to the curb. An officer stepped out, clipboard in hand, her expression cautious as she took in the scene. The man kneeling in the street, the dog trembling with his head pressed into the man's shoulder. "Sir?" She began gently. "Is this your dog?" David wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Yes. His name is Max. He's been missing for 3 years." She nodded, her face softening. "We'll need proof of ownership," she said quietly. "Do you have anything? Photos? Vet records?" David swallowed hard. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a worn picture he'd kept there all this time. A photo of Max as a puppy, sprawled across his lap with those same intelligent eyes. The officer took it carefully. "Do you mind if we scan his microchip?" To confirm, David nodded. Max stayed plastered to his side, watching the officer with wary eyes. When she passed the scanner over his shoulder, there was a tense moment of silence. Then, beep. Her face broke into a smile. "It's a match," she said. "Max is yours." David closed his eyes as relief crashed over him. Max let out a low, contented groan and leaned harder into his chest, as if he'd understood every word. Around them, drivers began to clap and cheer. But in that moment, David heard only the sound of Max's steady breathing. Proof that this was real, David thanked. The officer threw tears he no longer bothered to hide. He held Max close, feeling the dog's heart hammering as if it might burst. When he finally stood, Max stayed glued to his leg, every step careful, like he feared this was all a fragile dream. The officer handed back the worn photograph. "You're very lucky," she said softly. "Most dogs don't make it this long on their own." David looked down at Max, who gazed back with eyes that hadn't lost an ounce of love despite everything. "I think we both are," he whispered. They climbed into the truck together. Max hesitated just a moment, sniffing the seat as if to be sure it was safe, before curling into the same spot he'd claimed as a puppy. His tail thumped weakly, tapping the door in a steady rhythm. David ran a hand over Max's scarred shoulders. "Let's go home." Word of their reunion spread faster than David could have imagined. By the time he pulled into his driveway, a local news crew was waiting, cameras rolling. Someone had posted a video of Max racing into his arms, and it had already gone viral. Reporters asked how it felt to have his dog back after 3 years. David couldn't find the words. He looked at Max, who leaned out the window to press his nose to David's cheek, and let the gesture speak for him. That night, for the first time in years, Max lay stretched across the foot of David's bed. His breathing was slow and content, each exhale proof that love, real love, could survive any distance, any hardship, any lost day. And in the quiet darkness, David whispered, "You were never really gone."